Hello and welcome to week 17 of this rainy season video journal gardening thing. It's reached that point in the rainy season where it's not so much the things I want to get done as trying to keep the growth down so I can see the things that I want to keep alive and want to protect from, fire and slashes and tractors and so forth. So it's less of a productive week and more of a deconstructive week, but I think, it provides an opportunity to talk more a little bit about the type of environment and the woodlands. So yeah, if that's what you're up for, I guess, let's get on with it. So if the dogs will let me, without yapping at a passerby, we're going to talk a little bit about succession, and we're going to do that on a backdrop of different areas around the property which are in different stages sort of succession. So this little patch here, for example, this used to be a rubble heap, and so just before the rains the rubble was moved, and the soil in between them, which is more carbon rich than would usually be for just starting foundational soil, but it was sifted out and left, and I should have raked it out flat then, and I didn't, so I'm trying to do that now. But you can see just over 6 months or so, it has gone from bare, loose soil to quite densely covered grass. The root mat is more or less continuous, and all of the mass that has built up on top of this, whether or not I'm raking it away and putting it up in the raised beds, or if I'm just sort of digging it into the soil as I turn things over, it's all carbon. It's all building this soil up. Eventually this will be a little back garden, but that's sort of by the by. That's just a demonstration while the chickens dance. So that's your sort of first stage of vegetative succession. You get your open country, your meadowlands, your grasses, and if you have enough grazes, if you have enough sort of animals moving through that, or enough disturbance of another sort, so for example fires, that is as far as it will go a lot of the time. You will keep it without much woody growth, just soft annual and perennial grasses and herbaceous plants which are just tolerant of being trampled, tolerant of being eaten, tolerant of being burned, whatever is your limited succession. But as soon as you don't have those grazes or that fire or that trampling, this does become a very invasive habitat, and that's both by non-native species. So a lot of the invasive weeds you tend to come from these sorts of habitats in their native range, but also move into these habitats very readily. And ironically, this is very often the habitat that we create with our own lawns all over the world and our rather restricted gardens, but also through natural invasion. So you will get trees move into this habitat and shrubs move into this habitat to create a sort of scrubland. And this is happening on something of an accelerated scale here, because, so for example here in the Sandolive field, by cutting back the grasses, I am trying to encourage the growth of these scrubs to change it to the next phase as fast as possible. But I'm also very aware that until very recently we were surrounded by a lot more wild habitats, and there's still a few patches not too far from us for plants like these to send their seeds in. But one of the things you will notice about the trees you can see here, and so predominantly you're looking at Sandolive and terminated mollis, both of which have winged seeds, and there's also on another part of the Sandolive field, as we saw in a previous installment, there's a lot of the sycamore violet, which again these have seeds which are distributed by the wind. They're not carried by animals. This is still very much I don't want to say plant dominated, but the plants that get here are getting here of their own volition. And much as they're independent from animals, a lot of these trees are more or less independent from each other. So whereas a lot of woodlands tend to be, and forests tend to be very fungally associated, and most of the sort of final stage succession grasslands are also very fungally rich and fungally dependent, and a lot of the diversity in those grasslands, in the sort of really rich grasslands that you get in parts of the US and Asia, for example, a lot of that tends to be closely associated with the diversity of funguses beneath the soil. these trees are not dependent on a community, and so a lot of them, like the Sandolive, for example, has a phenomenally wide range and is still something that's very invasive outside of its natural range, because it doesn't really require specific conditions. It is not part of a community. It is a pioneer, and it behaves as such. Now, it does change the situation somewhat, but of its own accord, a lot of these trees would stay fairly low. They're not really trying to compete with anything apart from the grass, which, anything with a woody stem is going to stand taller than most grasses, apart from, bamboos. So there's not a great deal of pressure for them to get tall. I mean, they'll get to 3-4 meters of their own accord, and hopefully with a little bit of pruning I can push them up, which is then going to slow the wind down. And then we're going to start to see other plants coming in. As much as the pruning and chasing upwards of these trees is going to create a barrier to UV light, which is going to encourage a lot of the funguses to do better, and it's also going to slow the movement of wind and therefore keep everything just a little bit moister, which is again going to encourage the funguses and also make the ground a little bit more attractive for various seeds to germinate in without being sort of completely toasted. It also has another effect, which I think is a very sort of crucial one in a lot of African woodlands, in changing them to the next phase, which is that it creates an attraction for other animals. Now, this can be in more wild areas, something for a ruminant who is chewing the cud, for example, to lie down underneath, or it can be somewhere for a bird to perch or a bat to roost, and all of these things come with the production of seeds that they have consumed elsewhere. So, for example, fruit trees, which produce obviously edible fruit, which generally means that a seed gets swallowed. Not always. There are some seeds that just hope that something's going to carry them far enough in the process of trying to get the fruit off it. But also you have things like a lot of the acacias have a highly nutritious pod, which is very often eaten by a ruminant or a rodent, and then the seed is deposited somewhere else. And some of the seeds obviously get crushed up in the process, but enough survive that you have things like the Vegetative, which are the fairly bushy green trees in the sort of mid-background here, start to spring out of that. And that creates a higher woodland. These are, I would say, more competitive trees and will gradually exclude a lot of things like the Sandolives. But they're not a very dense shade, so it's not that they're going to rapidly change the underground, and they will also exist in isolation. So, for example, at one point the single most isolated tree on the planet was an acacia. There was no community to it. These are still not tied to other plants, even though they are using animals in their distribution, and having other plants around aids that. But both of these, for example, the guavas in the foreground, which are, again, they're a fruiting plant, which is invasive because of its fruit being quite so prolific and how easily the seed is distributed, but that's going to contribute a lot of phosphorus to the surface soil, which is going to change what can grow there, and the acacias are all going to contribute a lot of nitrogen, which is going to make it easier for a lot of other plants to grow underneath them. As the soil is enriched, then, some of those plants that are going to come up are more dependent on the communities of microorganisms and funguses, which I don't think can always be considered microorganisms, that start to pop up within that. And that's when you get things like the brachystegia, which is what forms the sort of foundation, although from above, of the thicket that you see in here now. And if I was sensible, I would have got a shot of the brachystegia to show you its sort of broad, dappled, shaded spread. But that then creates this entire system of plants which are dependent upon that shade, because there is so much more density to it. I mean, you can see there's barely any grass where I am here, and that's not from weeding. That is just because the combination of falling leaves and the sort of deeper soils make it a lot harder for small seeded plants to germinate. So there are grasses that will grow in this situation, but they don't tend to be those same fast-growing, straggly grasses which catch fire so easily. Certainly not once someone has started putting in ferns and other dense ground covers which contribute even more to the soil's growth, I suppose. I mean, you can see plants like the musakili coming up, which will eventually be a true forest tree. I mean, brachystegias are broadly a woodland tree, although they will survive in forest for a very long time after they are no longer the sort of king of the forest. But by doing this, I've created what I think are the ideal conditions for my fruit forest. So by ideal conditions, I kind of mean conditions where I can plant a very wide range of plants without having to compete with a very wide range of things that are springing up by themselves. So there are plants that will self-seed themselves here. So things like muscili, things like true forest trees. So if, for example, if there were ebonies nearby, they would almost certainly be seeding here quite merrily. But the palms and the mangoes and the muscilis that pop up are slow enough growing that I can manage them quite well and quite easily through pruning, through removing ones that are inconveniently placed, to make sure that I get an appropriate amount of light down to the plants that I want in this fruiting thicket. You can see I've even got quite a few succulents, and yes, these are on the edge of the thicket, but it's a very narrow band that actually the sunlight moves across this narrow band between two Brachystegia canopies. And again, it keeps the grass from being too dense. The succulents I put in have formed a fairly continuous ground cover. There's occasional bits of grass come through, but most of the management that is required is keeping the ground cover plants I put in from shading out any other plants that I want to be more successful. So things like the Plectranthus and the Kalanko, Fetch and Koi, which will become very dense. I just need to keep them below the level where other things have grown to, so that's both ornamentals and very occasionally things like the Peruvian apple, which is just on the right hand side of this rockery, which is edible, and various herbs that are in amongst all of this. This isn't an end point to succession, it's stabilized somewhat by my presence, very much like grazes in grassland, or for example fire in chippier woodland. But to maximize diversity, I don't actually want the entire 20 acres to end up looking like this. I do want to create a continuous cycle. So for example, coppicing some of the trees where the woodland gets dense, letting light in, letting other plants grow up, having things like the mole rats, which create disturbed soil and create spots for a lot of the annuals to pop up, which they would lose otherwise, hopefully means we can create a continuous matrix of diverse habitats to create the widest range of plants present, and then create the most stable possible community. So that's a bit of a rambling one, but with the exception of a little bit of weeding on this rockery, I think that is everything for this week. So I hope it wasn't too boring. I hope you feel like you learned something, or at least got a perspective on something. And yeah, have a good one, and if I'm more organised next week, it should be Tuesday, but somehow I doubt it.